Hi, do you want to learn to code by building over 20 apps for iPhone and iPad? My name's Rob and I'm the creator of the world's most popular coding courses with over 400,000 students and 20,000 5-star reviews. With this course, you get over 30 hours of crystal clear instruction showing you how to make apps for iOS 10 using Xcode 8 and Swift 3. You also get a whole host of extras, including $50 of Amazon AWS credit, a year's free web hosting, $300 of great-looking graphical assets, and a copy of my 5-star rated ebook, How to Earn $10,000 While Learning to Code. It's fun, fast, and guaranteed to lock in learning, or your money back. The course is entirely project-based, so we'll start by taking a tour of Xcode 8 and building a simple cat ears app. Next, you'll build a to-do list app, a tic-tac-toe game, and a blog reader app, before working your way up to Snapchat and Instagram clones. Then you'll build Tinder and Flappy Bird. I've carefully designed this course with you in mind. It doesn't matter if you're a beginner or an expert, you can rewind, refresh, or breeze through at your own pace. And if you get stuck, I offer fast and friendly support in the Q&A area. So what are you waiting for? If you're looking to build crazy powerful chart-topping apps or just learning for fun, click on the link below and join me on this incredible adventure today. Welcome to section 2 of the complete iOS 10 developer course. Now that you're all set up, we're going to be downloading Xcode and starting by having a look around the Xcode interface. Then we'll be dragging labels, images, buttons, and a whole lot more into our apps and see how to connect them to a little bit of Swift code. We'll even be building our first complete app called Cat Ears. There's nothing more to it. I hope you enjoyed this section and I'll see you at the beginning of the next one.
Xcode 8 is the latest version of Apple's Integrated Development Environment, or IDE. It's the only piece of software that you need for this course, and it's completely free. You can use it to build apps not only for iPhone and iPad, but Mac, Apple Watch, and Apple TV as well. The latest version is faster and more customizable than Xcode 7, and in particular has a great feature where you can preview what your apps will look like on various different screen sizes right there within Xcode. It's a really great piece of software to work with, and in this video I'm going to show you how to download and install Xcode. It's a pretty straightforward process. You just go to developer.apple.com/Xcode and then click on the blue download button. Now this will take you to a page where you need to log in to your Apple developer account. If you have an Apple ID, which you will likely have if you've used any Apple device, then just put in your email address and password there. And if not, then you can just click Create Apple ID to create a new one. It's worth noting that you don't need a paid Apple developer account to download Xcode or start building apps, but you do to get your apps in the App Store and start distributing them. But what we'll be learning in this course is completely free. So if you don't have an Apple ID, then just enter your email address, password, and some security details there. Select the options and click Continue, and that will take you through. I'm just going to log in with my existing Apple ID, and then you'll be taken to this download page. Now, at the time of recording this video, Xcode 8 is in beta, so I'm going to download the latest beta version, which I suggest you do as well. If you're watching this after around September 2016, Xcode 8 will likely be a full release, so just click to download the latest version. That will bring up the download window, and I'm just going to save it on the desktop there. Now, it is a pretty big download, 5.5 gigabytes, so you might want to go and make yourself a cup of tea and come back when it's done. I've just done that here. So now I'm going to jump over to the Finder and look on the desktop, and there's the Xcode 8 installation file. Now you just double click on that, and that will lead you through the whole process. It's a much simpler process than with Xcode 7. It's just a single installation, and then Xcode will be waiting for you. I've actually already gone through that process, so I'm going to cancel that now and start up Xcode. I'm going to do that with Command and Space, which brings up Spotlight, and then just start typing Xcode. And because I'm using the beta version, it's important that I run Xcode beta. If you're not using the beta version, then you can just use the main Xcode. So I'm going to click Xcode Beta, and then you'll see Xcode appear at the top left there. And that takes us to the end of the installation part of the setup process. In the next video, we'll see how to create your first Xcode project and indeed run your very first app within Xcode. See you there. Now that we've downloaded and installed Xcode 8, we're going to move straight on, create our first Xcode project. So I'm going to use Command Space to open up Spotlight and then type an X, and you can see it predicts. For me, I want Xcode Beta. If you're watching this video and Xcode 8 is not in beta anymore, then you'll just want the standard Xcode. You can see I've now got Xcode up here in the top left. So I'm going to click File, New, and Project. And this creates a whole new project which represents an app for iPhone and or iPad. And it will allow us to use the simulator as well to actually run our app on an iPhone right here within our machine. You can see we've got a number of application templates here, most of which we'll be looking at later on in the course. The main one that we're going to be using is a single view application, which is just a single screen onto which we can put our user interface elements. The rest are fairly self-explanatory. We've got a game using SpriteKit that we'll be using for our Flappy Bird game later on in the course. A master detail application. We'll be using this for our blog reader app. It's a great way of displaying a table of titles or email subjects or something like that, and then the main content on an iPad in the rest of the screen, or on an iPhone in a separate screen. So it's a really nice template if you want an app that's going to look good on both iPhone and iPad. And then you've got the quite similar page-based and tabbed application templates, and then the iOS 10 introduced sticker packs and iMessage applications, and you probably don't have the PhoneGap based application to left over from my web developer course. So select single view application, make sure you've got iOS selected, and then click Next. And now we can put in a whole host of options for our project, most of which we're going to keep at the default. The product name, you can call this product absolutely anything you like, but I'm going to use Hello World, which is pretty much the standard name for your first app on any system. But you can call it anything you like. The team is a way of organizing different developers within the same account. We're going to be working with that, but not quite yet, so you can just ignore the team for now. Organization name, you can put in anything you like, so just the name of your app development company, if you have one or could imagine one, or just your own first name and surname, if you'd rather. The organization identifier is what's known as a bundle prefix. Essentially, it's a way of uniquely identifying your organization, and it comes in the form of a reverse web address. So you usually start with .com and then your organization name. So here I might have Appfish. You can have whatever you like there, but it's generally best to keep it lowercase and just including normal letters, no symbols. The bundle identifier will then be generated automatically for you. And if you were going to release this on the App Store, this bundle identifier would have to be absolutely unique to your particular app. Of course, we're going to be working in Swift 3 to be precise, and we can choose which devices we're going to target. Is it iPhone, iPad, or both? And just to keep things simple for now, we'll stick with iPhone, but we'll definitely be working with universal apps later on in the course as well. Finally, we've got core data, which we're going to be looking at later in the course, so leave that unchecked for now. And unit tests and UI tests, which we're not going to be working with, so you don't need to select either of those. All right, then click Next, and all that's left is to decide where to save your app. I'm just going to put mine right there on the desktop. So Create. That will then create the app for you, and it will build all the files that you'll need. And this is now the Xcode interface, not the friendliest of bits of software to get to grips with, but don't worry, I'll guide you through it and you'll be comfortable with Xcode in no time. So here we've got our main 3-pane layout. We've got a left pane, our center pane, and the right pane. And generally speaking, the left pane will show the list of files for our app, although we can choose other bits of information to appear here if we want to. The central pane will be where we're working with our code or our app layout or in this case, our general settings for our app. We won't be editing anything here right now. We'll be coming back to this page quite regularly throughout the course. And the third pane over here is the context pane, which changes depending on what you've got selected. So as we look at different aspects of Xcode, you'll see that this pane updates with different content. And at the moment, we've got just the general information about the app, name, format, etc. So that's our main work area. Just above that, you can see here we've got a lovely big play button, which will allow us to run our app on the simulator, which we'll do very shortly. We can also choose a scheme, which is particularly useful working with things like app extensions, but early on in the course, we won't need to be working with schemes, so we can just leave that for now. What you might want to play around with is which device the simulator works with. So you can choose any of the latest Apple devices. I'm going to go for the 6S because that works quite well with my screen size. But you can change that and play around with it as you like. Finally, over here, we've got our assistant editor here, the two circles, which allows us to have two windows at the front. That's particularly useful when you're working with the code and layout of your app at once, but we don't particularly need it for now. So I'm going to click the single pane button there to get rid of that. And the third button there is for version control, which we'll be using later on in the course, but not right now, so we don't need to worry about that. This last one, however, is very useful if you're working with different parts of Xcode. Quite often you want to hide bits of the editor to keep your screen as uncluttered as possible. So you can do that with the left and right pane buttons there, and you can also bring in a bottom pane, which we'll mostly use for things like error messages and comments from within our app. So feel free to play around with those and see how you can customize the Xcode interface as you like. Finally then, in this video, we're going to have a look at two of the main files that we're going to be working with. So we'll be editing all of these files at some point in the course, but right now we're going to focus on two of them. The first I'm going to look at is the main storyboard. So I'm just going to double click on that and we'll see it appear in the central pane there. And this is a really great way to lay out your app and its user interface. So in the next video, we're going to be dragging and dropping elements onto this screen here. And as I mentioned in the previous video, we can actually click View As, and then we can choose any device we like there as our preview. So it's really easy to try out different sizes and see how our layout is going to look on the different screen sizes. So let's go back to our iPhone 6S. We can also change the orientation to make sure our app will look good in both portrait and landscape modes. I mentioned at the beginning of the video the importance of the word view, and you'll notice it comes up here in terms of view controller. So in this context here, the view is the whole screen of our, in this case, iPhone. The view controller then controls the view and sets the layout of the various user interface elements within the view. It gets a little bit confusing because you can have views within views. So this view is the whole screen, but we could also have a table view within that which showed a table, or a progress bar to show the user how far they are through a certain task. So essentially a view is anything that we make appear on the screen. We'll look at views in much more detail as we start adding things like images and labels to our user interface, which we'll do in the next video. The final thing I want to show you now then is viewcontroller.swift. And this is our Swift code which controls our app. So we're not going to be writing anything in here quite yet, but towards the end of this first section, we'll be editing this file to make our app interactive and essentially make it do something useful. So that's the Xcode interface and the two main files that we'll be working with. We've got the left pane with our file list, we've got our main editing window, and we've got our context sensitive pane, which you probably saw changing a few times as we clicked on different things within Xcode. Finally then, if you haven't already done so, let's see what happens when we click the play button to run our app on the iPhone 6S. Notice we haven't edited the app at all. So all our app is going to be is a blank screen. So not very exciting, but at least it'll show us that we've got something working. So we can click over to the simulator. You can see why I like the iPhone 6s there. Fits nicely in my screen. And as with any iPhone, it takes a little while to boot up. But when it's done, we should see our app running and our not particularly impressive blank screen app appear on the screen of the simulator. And there we go. You can see our first completely blank iPhone app is running on our mobile device here. That might be a little underwhelming, and we'll see how to add some content to our app in the next video. But for now, just notice that we're running a complete simulation of iOS 10 here in our device. And to see that in action, we can press Hardware and Home to simulate a home button click, and then you're back at the familiar iPhone screen, and you can mess around with all the apps on the iPhone, and you can also see the new widgets page in iOS 10. So there's your very own iPhone running on your computer. The last thing to notice is this output down here. This is known as the console, and you can see that Xcode 8 has given us a bunch of information about our app. This is nothing that we've coded, it's just the default information that you can use to debug and find out what your app is doing. We're going to learn how to put information ourselves down here very soon. For now though, you're hopefully reasonably comfortable with the Xcode interface, with our left pane, main editing window, and the right pane, and then the console down the bottom here. And we've also used the simulator to see how we can run iOS 10 on our computer and see our apps in action. All right, we're not content with a blank app for very long though, and we're going to see how to add our first user interface element in the next video, and that's going to be a label. Now that we're reasonably familiar with the Xcode interface and we've learned how to run a blank app on the simulator, we're going to start to add some content to our apps. And we're going to do that by having main storyboard selected. And I'm going to get rid of the console for the moment because we don't need that. And down here, we're going to now look at what's known as the object library. If you can't see that for any reason, make sure you've got main storyboard selected and the circle with a square inside it is blue. And that will show you the object library. And if you scroll down here, you can see all the different types of user interface element that we can add to our apps. They're starting to get more familiar as you get further down. A quick way to jump to a particular user interface element is to start to search for it in the filter box at the bottom. And we want perhaps the simplest user interface element, label. So once we've typed that in, we can just drag, so just click with the mouse and drag in your label. And there it is. So we've now got a label on our iPhone screen, and I'm just going to zoom in by pinching on my trackpad here. There's my label. So I'm going to just quickly double click on that and type Hello World to change the text of the label to Hello World. And now we're going to run the app again, jump back over to the simulator, and this time instead of seeing a blank app, we should see an app with Hello World towards the top left. And there we go. You can see our first app which actually does something. Now you may have noticed when I dragged that label in that there were some guidelines that appeared. Let's have a look at those in a little bit more detail. I can just drag it around here, and if I drag it to the left, you can see a blue dotted line, and there's another one just there. If I drag it to the center, I get another one, and then to the right there as well. And there's one down here right in the middle. Now these make it very easy to align your labels or whatever it is that you're bringing in to, say, the very center of the phone screen. But remember that that will only work for the particular phone screen size that you've got there at the moment. So don't rely on that to, for example, center your label on every phone size. To do that, we need to use something called constraints, which we'll look at later on in the course. For now, let's just see how we can adjust the look and content of this label. So notice in the context menu on the right here, if you have the label selected, then you'll be able to see a bunch of options for that label. So first off, you have the option to choose between plain and attributed text. Attributed allows you to use a special format to customize things like fonts and sizes. That's rather more complicated than plain, so we're not going to be looking at that right now. So we'll stick with plain. We can edit the content of the text label right there. But notice that if you do that, it doesn't change the width of the text label. So if, for example, you changed the content to something longer, then it would no longer fit. So you might need to stretch out the label if you change the content after you create the label. Color is pretty straightforward, but it allows us to see the color palette that we get with Xcode. We can either choose from a range of pencil colors there. You can see it updates immediately as we click on the colors, or you can choose a number of other ways to get your colors from a color wheel. You can even use the dropper to pick from a color anywhere on your screen. So if I particularly like that blue, for example, I can grab that and keep that as the color of my text. And you can use RGB sliders, pick from some of the default colors, or grab from a spectrum. So if we pick the green there, we can even choose the opacity, which allows us to create a label which is a little bit see-through. There's another way that we can do that, and I'll show you that in a minute. So that's how we choose the color of the label. I'm going to stick with this lovely green. We can also edit the font. So just click on the T there, and you can choose from all the standard fonts that we're used to seeing. Try that one out. There we go. And you can change the style to, say, bold or italic, and of course change the size as well. So if we increase that a little bit, then notice again, if it goes outside the range of our initial label box, we'll need to resize that to be able to see the whole thing. So I'll just drag it a little bit and then resize it. So we can see it there. And of course, if you've done that, you'll need to recenter as well. There we go. We can choose the number of lines our label has, which could be useful if I want a really long label. Then by default, that will go all on one line. So if I wanted it on 2 lines, I could just increase that to 2. And then we'll see our label on 2 lines there. If you want an infinite number of lines, so as many lines as necessary, then you can put 0 there. That's quite handy. You can choose whether the behavior is enabled or highlighted. You probably won't need to use either of those. And I'm going to jump through these rather advanced formatting options, aligning baselines, etc. But I will show you the quite handy auto shrink feature, which if, for example, your text is too big for your box, then you can choose to have a minimum font scale, which will allow all the text to appear, but that minimum font scale will only let it go so small. So in this case, 0.5. If you want it to go smaller than that, then you can change that to say 0.1, and then it will go even smaller. Whether that's a good idea or not depends on your particular app. Then we've got the option to add a highlight and a shadow. I'll just show you what shadow looks like. So we can add, say, a blue shadow there and change the offset. So that looks fairly ugly, but you get the idea of what's going on there. The offset is the number of pixels to the right and below that the shadow appears compared to the original text. Then we've got a few view options, most of which we're not going to use right now, but we will see later on. Labels generally don't have any interaction to them, so multiple touch is not particularly useful. It's worth noting the alpha. This value is another way of changing the opacity that we saw before. So 1 is an opacity which is completely not see-through, but if we change that to say 0.5, then that will be half see-through, and the lower the number, the fainter the text, or the less opaque it is. So that can be very useful. We can change the background. Nice and easy. And finally, we've got some fairly advanced options which aren't really of any use to us here. Feel free to play around with them if you like, but most of the time with labels, we're just going to be customizing fonts, colors, and sizes. So hopefully that's all pretty straightforward. I'm going to set you a quick challenge to give you a practice with labels. So I want you to select your label and then press backspace to delete it. And quite simply, I want you to create a label that looks like this. That is situated at the top of the screen, just underneath the battery info bar. At the center, says hi there, is centered, and is pretty big. I'm not going to be too fussy about the precise size. So pause the video and go for it. All right, hope you managed that. Should have been a fairly straightforward challenge. All you needed to do was drag in the label, and we wanted it centered and just underneath the battery bar there. So I'm going to make sure it's aligned to those two blue dotted lines. Remember, that will only work on the iPhone 6s and the iPhone 6 because they're the same size. It won't be centered on all devices. Then I'm going to change the text to hi there, like that, and I'm going to increase the size. There we go. Next, I'm just going to resize that so that I can see the whole thing. And to make sure it's centered, I'm going to click center there, and then drag it back in place again so that it's definitely centered now that I've changed the size. All right. And as much as this should be a perfect representation of what you see on your screen, it's always a good idea just to run it on the simulator to make absolutely sure that it appears correctly. And there we go. You can see we've got our text just under the info bar at the top. It says hi there, and it's pretty big. So that's as far as we're going to go with labels. Feel free to add some more and play about with them if you like, but we're going to head towards some rather more interactive user interface elements in the next video, and they are text inputs and buttons. In the previous video, we saw how to add and customize labels in our apps, which is a great way of displaying information, but it's no good for having any kind of interaction with the user. So in this video, we're going to see two more user interface element types, the text field and the button. So if we search for text in the object library, we'll see the text field there. So let's just drag that in, and I'm going to center it just underneath the hi there label that we added in the previous video. And you can see it takes on the standard iOS look. And just like with labels, we can stretch them out. So I'll stretch this one out to the end of the screen. And let's just have a quick look before we customize this text field, how it responds in the app itself. And there it is. And you can see if we tap in the text field there, you can see that the iOS keyboard pops up, and we can even type in it and get a response. Although it's a little slow on my simulator here. Yours should be a bit faster. It's worth noting as well that if you have a look in the hardware menu, then you can decide whether you use the hardware keyboard or the software keyboard, or indeed both. So at the moment we're using both. I can type in using the software keyboard, although as I say, it's pretty slow. But I can also type in just using my normal keyboard, which is a little bit quicker. So I'm going to be using that for the rest of this course. So most of the time you're going to want to keep your text inputs pretty close to the default. They look pretty good anyway, and they're what people are going to be expecting to see if they are required to enter some text but there are a few options that are worth being aware of. So as before, we can change the color if we really want to. That will change the color of the text inside. We can have some text there by default if we want to, but more common is to use what's known as a placeholder, which is better than entering default text, because if you have a placeholder, it will tell the user to do something, and then when they tap on that box, then the placeholder disappears and they can start typing. Whereas if you put text into a box, they have to manually select and delete that text before they can enter anything. So generally you're going to want a placeholder rather than text for a text input. I'm just running that to show you that in action. And here we go. So there's my text box. And when I tap in it, then I can just start writing. And the placeholder text disappears. See, my beta version is not the speediest here. Yours, as I say, should be quite a bit faster. Okay, so that's placeholders. We can add a background image there if we want to. We can add a background image for when the text field is disabled. We can change the border style, just like that, although I'd recommend keeping it at the default. We can decide whether there is a clear button. That is the little X that appears on the right here. We can even opt to clear every time the user starts editing. We can adjust the minimum font size, and we can choose to adjust the text size to fit in the box if we want to. Now these options are very useful. Depending on what's going to be entered, we might want some sort of capitalization. If we're entering, say, a username or something like that, then we wouldn't. But if we were entering a name, then we'd probably want each word to be capitalized. And we can change the options there if we want to. We can switch on and off corrections and spell checking as well. And very usefully, we can change the default keyboard type. So if we wanted to enter a phone number, for example, we can make sure that it's the number pad that appears when the user taps in that box. And we can also choose email address and various other types of data entry that we might need. It's definitely worth paying attention to that. It makes your app a lot more usable if the user is presented with the right type of keyboard. And we can change the appearance there, and we can customize the word on the return key as well. And down here we've got some alignment options, and we can decide whether it's enabled, selected or highlighted. And again, just like with labels, we've got some view modes that we rarely use with text fields, so I'm not going to pay much attention to those right now. Unlike with labels, user interaction is enabled because by default we're going to want the user to be able to type something in, but we're not going to want multiple touch most of the time. And again, we've got the options of setting an alpha to show how opaque or transparent we want the text field to be. And we can choose a background and a tint color as well. And those same options as with labels that you're unlikely to want to edit. So that's how text fields work. Now let's see how we work with buttons in iOS development. Unsurprisingly, you search for button and then we just drag it in. So again, I'm going to center our button and display it right there. So in iOS 10, as in previous versions, buttons are pretty minimalist. They're just by default blue text. But just with labels, we can change the content of the button. And again, just like with text fields, we'll just run the app to see what the default effect of a button is without changing any of these options. And here we go, there's our button. So when I tap it, you get this nice buttony effect without having to do anything. Of course, that button won't actually control anything in our app until we write some code for it, which is what we'll be doing in the next video. So let's just quickly run through some of the button options. We can choose from a number of different button types, Almost always you're going to want the system button, but there are some defaults, for example, an info button, which looks like that, and some other options there. But as I say, the vast majority of the time we'll want a system type button. In fact, I'll just use undo Command Z to get back to what we had before. Buttons have states. So the states here are default, which is when the button is just on the screen but not being pressed. Highlighted is when the user has tapped on it. Focused, we don't generally use for buttons. With the text field, for example, when the text field is focused, that means the cursor will be on it and the user will be able to type something into it. But usually with buttons, if it's being pressed, then it's highlighted. So we don't really need to worry about the focused state for buttons. Again, selected as well, we don't generally use for buttons. Disabled we might use if we want to show that some option is not available for some reason. So the major two that you work with for buttons are default and highlighted. So looking at the default, we can choose again plain or attributed, just like with the labels, and we can change the font, color, shadows, image, and a background image if we want to. I won't go into all of those as we've seen how they work with labels, but feel free to play around with them if you like. We've got a few effects that we can apply. You can play with if you want to. Reverses on highlight, shows touch on highlight, and working with the button image. We can choose where the line break comes. And as before, we've got some options that we're unlikely to want to change at this point. And the familiar user interaction enabled, alpha, background, etc., as we've seen before. All right, so I'm just going to clear the page here and set you a quick challenge. And in this challenge, I want you to create this mini form. So all we're doing is asking for the user's email address. We're going to have the form aligned to the right of the screen for some reason, just to practice that, and then a submit button at the bottom. That's all you need to do. Go for it. All right, I hope you managed that. Let's start by adding our label. So I'm going to line it to the right where the blue is, the blue guiding line. And then I'll just double click, what is your email address? There we go. And that actually aligns itself just right. So then I'm going to bring in my text field. I'm going to drag that in the now hopefully familiar way. And you can see when we've got more than one element, it aligns or gives us the option to align the second element with the first. So that will then give a nice bit of space between the label and the text field. And I'm going to drag that out and use the blue marking lines again to make those the same width. I'm going to add a placeholder. Enter your email. And bonus points if you did this, I'm going to choose the keyboard type to be email address. And then finally, I'm going to add my button aligned nicely and just change to submit. There we go. And as always, when we've done a layout, I'm just going to run it on the simulator to make sure it looks the same in the flesh, as it were. And there we go. You can see it's all nicely right aligned. And even when we click in the email address, you can see we've got the email keyboard here because we've got the @ symbol and the dot at the bottom. So there we go. We can now add labels, text fields, and buttons to our apps, but so far we're not able to actually make them do anything. To do that, we need to learn a little bit of code, Swift code to be precise, and that's what we're going to do in the next video.